Have you ever stopped to think about how sometimes just a simple phrase can hold, well, just centuries of human experience, how it can sort of encapsulate these really deep truths about how we interact as societies? Today, we're doing one of our deep dives into exactly that kind of phrase, welfare fatigue. Now, on the surface, you hear that, you think budgets, right? Government spending, maybe political fights.
Sure. Usual stuff.
But our source material today suggests it hides something much, much deeper, something more complex and honestly really ancient, a human tension that goes way beyond dollars and cents. It touches something, well, fundamental about how we feel about giving and getting help.
That's exactly right. For this deep dive, we're looking at something truly fascinating. Our main source, it's titled Welfare Fatigue, the Moral Economy of the Mat. A diagnosis, it really eliminates what it calls the moral economy that kind of underpins all welfare systems, ancient ones, modern ones, you name it.
A moral economy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So our mission today is to really unpack that. We want to get past the usual surface level talk, delve into the unspoken contracts, the kind of surprising psychological costs, and the really deep historical roots of how we feel collectively about supporting vulnerable people.
Right. Moving beyond just the policy debates.
Precisely. We want to help you, the listener, really grasp this fundamental tension. It's often just ignored in modern discussions about welfare, but it's always there. And I think you'll find the insights we're about to uncover are, well, not just surprising, but probably pretty resonant with things you've maybe thought or observed yourself.
Okay, let's dive right in then. This idea of welfare fatigue. Our source tackles it head on. What is it exactly, according to this analysis? What's really at the core of it, beyond just, being tired of taxes?
Well, the source paints a really vivid picture, and honestly, it's a bit uncomfortable. It argues welfare fatigue isn't just people getting tired of paying taxes or seeing programs that maybe don't work perfectly or seem inefficient. Instead, it defines it quite profoundly, I think, as the secret psychic cost at the heart of every modern safety net. Think about that phrase for a second. Secret psychic cost. It's not obvious, right? Not a line item on a budget sheet, but this hidden emotional weight.
A psychic cost.
Yeah. And the source argues that whether you're looking way back, maybe the Roman grain dole, giving out basic food to keep people from rioting, or you're looking at a modern American SNP card helping families buy food. These systems, just by how they're designed, they inevitably contain, and this is another great phrase, the seeds of their own discontent.
Seeds of their own discontent. That's a strong claim. What does that actually mean for how these systems are set up?
It means they're built on this really fundamental promise that the collective right, all of us, the community, the taxpayers, will consistently, willingly bear the burdens of the vulnerable people within that community. Now, on the face of it, that sounds noble, compassionate.
Of course. It's what
Right.
societies do.
Absolutely. It's a cornerstone of a decent society.
Yeah.
But the source argues this very promise, as foundational and well-meaning as it is, carries this inherent unavoidable tension right from the start.
A tension baked right in.
Baked right in. And this tension, it might be subtle at first, but it can fester, it can grow, and eventually it leads to these really deep feelings of unease, frustration, and, exhaustion, which is exactly the welfare fatigue we're talking about. It's almost like a design flaw, you could say, in how humans react emotionally when charity becomes institutionalized, when it's not just a personal act anymore.
Okay, so this isn't just a modern policy headache. It's something fundamental going way back. That secret psychic cost. It makes me think of some kind of invisible weight people carry. Tell me more about this ancient tension the source mentions. How does it actually show up?
It comes down to something the source calls, quite provocatively, the uneasy human craving for visible helplessness.
Visible helplessness. Wow.
Yeah, it's a really crucial insight because it kind of challenges our usual, maybe idealized ideas about charity. Look, giving freely, helping those in need, and we all agree that's good, right? Virtuous. It hits our moral core, our empathy. You want to help.
Sure.
But here's the really uncomfortable, almost taboo truth the source brings out. That good feeling, that satisfaction of doing the right thing, it can be completely, almost instinctively undermined if the person receiving the help doesn't. Well, they don't look sufficiently broken, grateful, or small.
Oof, that's blunt.
It is. The source states it very clearly. Giving freely when the recipient seems too capable, maybe too composed, too normal. That is, to invite an almost primordial resentment. And the key thing here is this isn't about logic. It's not rational accounting. It's not even intentional cruelty. It's described as this deep-seated, almost evolutionary human reaction, a gut feeling that's hard to pin down or justify rationally.
That actually makes an uncomfortable amount of sense. You hear echoes of it all the time, don't you? In
Yeah.
conversations, online comments. Even if people don't label it primordial resentment, it's that feeling of, okay, I'm doing my part, I'm paying in, but are they really struggling? Are they really holding up their end of whatever the bargain is? It's this instant, often unspoken flicker of suspicion.
Precisely. The source gives this really vivid example, focusing on the taxpayer. The person who diligently pays the taxes, but also resents the ease with which the recipient might stand up straight when they should stay crouched and scraping.
Wow, crouched and scraping. Powerful imagery.
It really is. It captures that subtle, often unvoiced suspicion that maybe someone's gaming the system, that maybe they aren't quite in the dire situation they seem to be. There's this implied social contract, right?
Yeah.
I give because you can't. And if that can't starts to look questionable, even just a little bit, the resentment starts brewing. And the crucial point the source hammers home is that this isn't just about dollars and cents or worrying about deficits. This deep resentment, this welfare fatigue, it's not an itemized cost you'll find on any government spreadsheet. You can't easily measure it.
Right.
And yet it's this profound emotional burden that everyone senses. It kind of seeps into and complicates every single discussion we have about safety nets, making them so much more complex than just economic models or policy papers.
Yeah.
It's that unitemized psychological cost that quietly fuels all the whispers and the public arguments around welfare fatigue.
Okay, this is where, for me, it gets really fascinating because it gives us this incredible lens to look at our modern systems through. Our source takes us way back to the ancient village. What can the beggar in that setting teach us about this moral economy? What was that unwritten deal?
Oh, this is such a brilliant move in the analysis. It grounds everything we're seeing today in this ancient, persistent human truth. So picture the ancient village. The beggar there, the source argues, instinctively understood this fundamental bargain we've been circling around, this implicit moral contract.
He just knew.
Knew it in his bones, seemingly. The source describes how this beggar would meticulously, quote, made himself legless, or at least appeared so. He'd be seen crawling on a rolling pallet, knocked his bowl with a stick, kept his eyes down. Now, this wasn't just, desperation. It was the deliberate, calculated, and highly effective performance.
Oh, performance. Okay.
Yeah. And this performance, the source says beautifully, was as old as bread. Think about that. A timeless, ritualized act of survival honed over countless generations.
So it was a kind of necessary theater to survive, and this performance involved knowing what people needed to see and what needed to stay hidden. It hints at a sort of double life.
Exactly. That's crucial. The beggar knew the value of the costume. He understood there was, quote, the ruined coat for the square, the one specifically designed to trigger pity, get those alms, presenting this image of utter, undeniable destitution.
Right, the public face.
The public face. But then there is also the cleaner tunic for home, reserved for his private life, away from the judging eyes of the village. This skill, this ability to maintain the public image of helplessness while holding on to some private dignity, maybe even some capability, was absolutely essential to the whole arrangement. It was the careful management of this double life that, to use the source's metaphor again, allowed the milk to keep flowing.
And you mentioned earlier we'd probably slap the label fraud on that today if someone was faking a need. But the source pushes back, calling it a social contract. What's the real difference there? Why is that distinction so important?
This is where the source makes a really critical and I think quite challenging distinction for us. Because yes, in our modern legal and ethical frameworks, if someone's pretending to be disabled or needy to get benefits, we'd immediately, and probably rightly, call it fraud.
Yeah, that's the default reaction.
But the source argues that in moral terms, it was a kind of social contract. Now, that completely shifts how we see it. It wasn't about lying just to lie or trying to maliciously steal something. It was more about upholding this implicit, unwritten agreement that everyone, the giver and the receiver, kind of understood on some level.
An understanding between them.
Yes. The terms of this ancient contract were brutally simple. Visible ruin in exchange for alms. Secrecy for small dignities carried behind closed doors. The beggar got this. Deep down, he knew the village would keep feeding him, only so long as he gave them back their moral comfort.
Their moral comfort, meaning the comfort of knowing their charity was truly needed, truly justified.
Exactly. That comfort came from seeing someone who's clearly, visibly, undeniably in need, someone broken, humble. If that image got shattered, if the visible need wasn't convincing enough, that emotional and moral contract was broken instantly. And the alms, they dry up fast.
Yeah, that's powerful. It really highlights how direct and personal that ancient contract was, almost like a face-to-face negotiation every day, which feels worlds away from our big impersonal bureaucratic systems now.
Worlds away. The source really emphasizes this. This was not Caesar's problem, not yet. It was the village's problem.
Yeah.
This wasn't some state-run program. It was local, immediate,
Yeah.
intensely personal. The interaction was right there, face-to-face. The feedback was instant, tangible.
No appeals process.
None. If the village's collective patience just snapped, right? If the beggar's performance slipped and didn't provide that necessary moral comfort anymore, there was no higher authority to complain to, no distant government office. The beggar did not petition Rome for his ration. The source is very clear. He crawled to the next village or starved where he lay. That stark reality just shows you the raw, immediate consequences of this ancient moral economy. The gaze of the community, the village's collective conscience that was the ultimate judge. And the beggar's survival literally depended on perfectly maintaining that tricky balance between visible, undeniable need and that unseen, private dignity. And that direct connection, that immediate feedback loop, it stands in such stark contrast to the huge anonymous bureaucracies and, the long impersonal lines we often see in modern welfare.
Okay, so the source sets up this ancient system, this moral economy of the beggar. But then it takes this really powerful turn. It brings in Jesus, who, as the text says, kind of walks into this timeless contract with a sledgehammer and also with a crust of bread. That's quite an image. How did his approach just completely differ from this ancient bargain and really from any system we've talked about? It sounds like a total reset.
It really is presented as a radical departure, yeah. And it throws down a profound challenge to our basic assumptions about compassion, about welfare. The source points out a critical difference right off the bat. Jesus fed thousands, yes, but never with Caesar's taxes.
Ah, okay. That's key.
Absolutely key, because it immediately separates his actions from any kind of state-funded, tax-based, institutionalized welfare system. Think about the famous story, multiplying the loaves and fishes, feeding thousands from almost nothing. The source highlights that this miracle happened not by commanding the local treasury to fund it, but by taking what was freely offered. A few scraps from a boy, handed back out with nothing asked in return except faith.
So it wasn't a program. It wasn't policy.
Exactly. It wasn't about setting up aid programs or using tax money. It was about spontaneous, voluntary generosity meeting immediate, obvious need. A direct, spiritual kind of exchange totally unburdened by bureaucracy or eligibility criteria or public funding debates. It just happened, completely outside the existing moral economy.
So you couldn't really build a state on that model, could you? It was a fundamentally different kind of economy based on entirely different rules.
Fundamentally different. The core principle Jesus laid out was incredibly direct. You received without charge, give without charge. That's from Matthew's gospel. And the source really stresses this. He did not build an empire of dole collectors. He did not build Rome for his miracles. His whole ministry seems characterized by this direct, unburdened flow of grace and provision.
Mm-hmm.
And when he sent his disciples out, the instructions were just as stark. Take no gold or silver for your purses. The laborer deserves his keep. Now, this was emphatically not a call for endless handouts. It wasn't about setting up a permanent welfare state. It was about, as the source puts it, a direct short-circuit exchange. Give what you have, receive what you need, move on if they do not want it.
Move on if they do not want it. Okay.
Yeah. It was about meeting immediate needs through these spontaneous acts of faith and community support, voluntary support, not through some top-down, state-managed, tax-funded system that requires you to constantly perform your neediness.
That disgumption, move on if they do not want it, that sounds like there were really clear limits to this mercy, a kind of mercy with edges, maybe. That doesn't sound like the unconditional, infinite giving we sometimes imagine. That must have really clashed with the existing moral economy.
It must have. And the source uses that exact phrase, mercy with edges. It's an incredibly powerful concept, maybe even a bit unsettling for us today, especially when we often aim for this idea of endless compassion. Jesus' mercy wasn't boundless in the sense of being forced on people or just endlessly available even if they rejected it or took it for granted.
Right.
He gave his disciples a very strong boundary. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet when you leave that home or town. That's Matthew 10 again. This instruction just powerfully underlines a kind of mercy that gave freely but never begged to be received.
It required something from the receiver, too. Respect, willingness.
Exactly. It implied a necessary mutual respect, a genuine willingness to accept the gift, the healing, the message. If that wasn't there, if the gift was mocked or the message refused, then the interaction just ended decisively.
Hmm.
It was mercy that walked away the moment it became a farce.
Mm.
Now, that's a profoundly challenging idea for many of us because it contrasts so sharply with the modern impulse to just keep extending aid almost indefinitely, regardless of how the recipient responds or whether they show any real desire for genuine, lasting change and independence. This form of mercy was about a kind of radical freedom, freedom for the giver and freedom for the receiver to either accept or reject that path to wholeness.
Okay, so we have this ancient moral economy of the beggar, and then Jesus' really radical departure from it. What does all this mean for us now when we talk about welfare fatigue today? Our source makes this really sharp point that the problem isn't that our basic moral instinct has changed, but that we pretend it has. That feels uncomfortable. Can you unpack that paradox for us?
Yeah, it is a really searing observation, isn't it? It cuts right to the core of our modern dilemma. The source digs deep into this internal conflict, the often unspoken tension within the modern taxpayer, and maybe within society as a whole.
Mhm.
On the one hand, we tell each other, our goal is to help the poor become whole, lift them
Yes.
out of poverty, integrate them fully.
The ideal.
The ideal. We genuinely repeat these slogans about empowerment and dignity. Or we might even, as the source says, hold up the gospel story of the loaves and fishes as if Jesus set up a permanent soup line underwritten by Rome. As if that was the model endless state-funded charity with no friction. We justify our complex systems with these really high-minded, benevolent ideas.
So we say one thing, but then our gut reaction tells a different story. Where does that clash actually happen?
Exactly. That's the paradox right there. The
Mhm.
clash happens when confronted with the reality that many who receive aid do not look, act, or sound sufficiently grateful or perpetually pitiful. That's when the cherished ideal crashes hard against this very human, very visceral, sometimes primitive reaction.
Mhm.
The source gives some really poignant examples. When they post a selfie with a new phone, stand up too straight in line, wear good shoes, speak too freely about what they think they are owed, in those moments, the suspicion of betrayal blooms like mildew in the soul,
Wow, mildew in the soul. That's evocative.
isn't it? And the source stresses this reaction. It isn't necessarily logical. It's not rational. You can't really justify it with a spreadsheet.
Hmm.
But it is deeply human. It taps right back into that ancient primordial resentment we talked about earlier.
Hmm.
That deep discomfort when someone receiving aid looks, well, too independent or not humble enough. It's that gut feeling of being taken advantage of, even if no actual rule has been broken.
That phrase, the optics of undeservingness, really captures it. It's not about proven fraud necessarily, but about how things look, how they feel, against some kind of unwritten rule or expectation.
Precisely. The source is really clear. This isn't primarily about fraud in the strict legal sense, though. Yeah, fraud happens in any system like this. It's fundamentally about what moral economists would call the optics of undeservingness. That's the critical idea. And here's the kicker. The welfare bureaucracy itself does not demand a permanent limp. The public mind does.
Ooh, the public mind demands it, not the rules on paper.
Right. It's the invisible collective expectation of the giver, the moral class, that really drives this whole dynamic. The source notes that the same working person who signs the check with a sigh will rage if they think they see legs under the mat. This just reveals this incredibly fragile membrane that keeps the entire moral economy flowing. The visible difference between the humbled, visibly dependent recipient and the standing, often resentful giver.
So the system itself ends up managing two different risks.
In a way, yes. The welfare state, in this view, primarily manages the risk of riots. It provides that basic safety net to prevent absolute desperation, social collapse. But then the ritual scraping, that performance of need and humility we talked about, that manages the risk of moral revolt from the taxpayers. They need to believe their money is going to genuinely helpless people to keep supporting the system. It becomes this delicate, constant balancing act designed to keep both the recipients and the benefactors sort of pacified, maintaining this uneasy social peace.
This balancing act, though, it leads to a really challenging question the source raises directly. Why should any of this matter if the goal is just to help people? Shouldn't the dignity of the poor be the number one goal, the overriding aim of any decent society? That question cuts right to the heart of what we think we're doing when we offer help.
It does. And the source provides a very candid, almost bracingly honest answer that really challenges our standard thinking, our stated ideals. It says, in theory, yes, dignity should be the goal. That's the aspiration we talked about. But the social reality is that the welfare system has become the de facto company store for the moral class, not the place of gospel miracles.
The company store for the moral class. Wow, can you unpack that metaphor? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor. A company store historically was where workers, often in isolated mining towns or plantations, got credit instead of cash wages. They had to buy everything there, often at inflated prices, trapping them in debt, making it impossible to save money or leave.
So the system, even with good intentions, ends up trapping people in dependence, while also maybe serving the psychological needs of the givers, the moral class.
That's exactly the argument. The source contends that the system's actual practical purpose, whether anyone says it out loud or not, is not to transform people, not really to empower them to stand completely on their own 2 feet and never need help again.
So what is its purpose then in this view?
Fundamentally, it exists to keep the masses pacified. It serves several unspoken functions. One, it prevents the poor from rioting by meeting the most basic desperate needs. Two, it keeps the marginally employable from becoming truly desperate, stopping them from falling into total destitution, which could be disruptive. And three, maybe most critically for the comfort of the wider society, it reassures the middle that they are not monsters for letting so many slip through the cracks.
It manages guilt as much as need.
That's a big part of this perspective. It suggests the system is designed more for overall social stability and the psychological comfort of the givers than for genuine, widespread, permanent transformation of the recipients. And because of that, this source concludes, kind of inevitably, that transformation is not built in, and so the scraping never ends. That visible performance of need, the very thing needed to keep the moral economy functioning and the aid flowing, tragically end up preventing the very outcome, full independence, real dignity that we claim as the system's ideal.
That's a really uncomfortable idea, a system that, just by functioning, kind of perpetuates the dependence it's supposed to fix. And it leads to another pretty unsettling thought from the source, that almost perversely, people learn to lean into this visible ruin to play the part. What does that do to the performance we talked about? How does it shape how people behave?
It's a deep dive into the psychology of the system's unintended consequences. The source argues that if that performance of ruin isn't kept up, if the cues aren't right, then the beggar who forgets the script jeopardizes the teat for everyone.
Wow, forgetting the script harms everyone.
That's the idea. Imagine the domino effect. If the stumps become legs, metaphorically speaking, if the pallet rolls out of sight and the man stands up too soon, basically, if the recipient shows too much capability, too much independence, too much normalcy, then the whole pity center begins to look suspect. The moral justification for the system feels threatened.
And that triggers a reaction.
A predictable one. This visible contradiction leads to almost knee-jerk reactions from the public and then from the system itself. Calls for audits, for new paperwork, for cuts, for tighter means tests. The system clamps down because the moral comfort of the givers, that fragile membrane we talked about, feels breached.
So the pressure to not get better, or at least to not look like you're getting better, becomes incredibly intense. It's that quiet mutual fraud you mentioned.
Exactly. The source explains that perversely, the poor learn to lean into the visible ruin, to crawl convincingly, to keep the Chanel tunic hidden at home. It stops being just a conscious strategy for survival. It becomes this deeply ingrained way of behaving. It really is a quiet mutual fraud. The taxpayer wants the theater. They need that performance of need to feel okay about giving, and the beggar delivers it.
A transaction.
A kind of transaction, yeah. An unspoken arrangement that keeps the breast producing milk so long as the performance reassures the moral mind that no one is getting away with anything. Basically, for the system to keep working, for the aid to continue, the show must go on. It's this complex, almost symbiotic relationship built on a pretense, often subconscious, that serves both sides in its own rather twisted way.
But now we have the internet, and this quiet mutual fraud, this carefully managed performance is suddenly being exposed in ways nobody could have imagined before. That feels like a massive modern twist on this ancient dynamic. It must create all sorts of new friction.
Oh, it's hugely disruptive, almost revolutionary in how it impacts this ancient moral economy. The source points out the beggar now has a phone, a camera, an audience bigger than any village square. That changes absolutely everything.
The scale is different. The visibility is different.
Totally. What used to be a private, localized performance, right, confined to a specific place with a carefully hidden double life, is now subject to instant global scrutiny. The ancient rolling pallet has a live feed, essentially viewable by anyone online. That carefully built illusion, It's suddenly incredibly fragile, vulnerable to complete collapse.
One wrong post.
Exactly. The same man who knocked the bull with his stick by day now shows his hidden legs by night, by accident or bravado. Maybe posts an innocent picture, makes a casual comment online that reveals too much. The internet has just made the old double life harder to contain. It blurs and often just obliterates the line between survival performance and real healing.
So the digital proof, the screenshot, the video clip, it spreads instantly and just shatters that carefully maintained illusion. And the reaction must be immediate and pretty intense.
Absolutely immediate. Think about it. People now watch screenshotted, clipped, remixed, the hidden Schnell, the decent meal, the joke about scamming the system. These tiny glimpses of a life that doesn't fit the visibly ruined script. A moment of normalcy, a bit of dignity, maybe even something seen as a luxury, the luxury. They instantly break the spell for countless observers worldwide.
And the cry goes up. Fraud! Predictably, yeah.
And predictably, the audience cries, fraud. But here's the crucial insight the source really nails. It's not because the con is new, but because the illusion cracked in public. The moral contract, the one that depended on private performance and hidden dignity, it's been breached in the most public forum imaginable. This public unmasking, thanks to technology everywhere, creates this new, amplified level of friction in the old moral economy. It just pours gasoline on those feelings of welfare fatigue and suspicion among the givers. The stakes feel higher, the discomfort is way more widespread and much, much louder than it ever was before.
Okay, the source then draws this really stark contrast between the modern system with all its contradictions and demands for performance and Jesus' actions. It says, Jesus, for his part, refused to keep the healed man on the mat. Now, that's a powerful statement, especially after discussing this whole moral economy of dependence.
It is a powerful statement, yeah. And it's deliberately provocative, I think, from the source. It's used to highlight this really challenging, often quite uncomfortable aspect of Jesus' ministry that maybe gets glossed over in our modern, sometimes sentimental views of compassion and charity.
Right.
Time after time in the Gospels, when Jesus healed someone, his instruction was incredibly direct, absolute, and strikingly transformative. Get up, take your mat, and walk.
Right.
It wasn't the suggestion, right? It was a clear command. Shed the symbols, physical and otherwise, of your dependency.
And not just that, sometimes he added more.
Often, yes. He'd also say, go, show yourself to the priest, which was a concrete step towards re-entering society, being reintegrated into the community as a whole person, healthy, self-sufficient, fulfilling your religious and social duties.
So no ambiguity, no gray area where you could kind of keep relying on help, maybe just for comfort. It was a total shift.
Exactly. The source emphasizes there was literally no third option. You either stayed broken, stayed in need, or you stood up, embraced full restoration, full responsibility. You did not crawl back to the mat for tomorrow's scraps. That implies a flat refusal to allow dependency to continue or to play along with any performance of ruin. Once you were healed, the expectation was crystal clear. You rejoined the community. That was part of the healing itself, not just physical, but social, spiritual reintegration. It was an act that just completely disrupted the existing moral economy, which, as we've seen, kind of benefited from visible, ongoing helplessness.
That's a side of Jesus maybe we don't talk about as much. I don't know, tough love maybe. That demands action, accountability, self-reliance in the end. The source even uses this really provocative term, asshole Jesus, to get at this. Can you explain that? Why does the source think it's important to bring that aspect up?
Yeah, asshole Jesus, it's definitely used provocatively by the source to describe, quote, the side we sanitize. The inconvenient truth about divine mercy that maybe we prefer to ignore. It refers to Jesus' clear willingness to just walk away from people who rejected his gift or mocked the miracle or refused to act on the healing they received.
He walked away.
Yes. The source uses a stark example.
Yeah.
If you spat on the gift. And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. That's from Matthew 13. It shows pretty clearly that while his mercy was given freely, it wasn't just endlessly forced on people who were unwilling to receive it in faith or act on it. He did not reach deeper into Judas's purse to keep the ungrateful alive. He did not lean on Caesar to keep paying for those who refused to stand. Instead, if his message was rejected, if his gifts were scorned, if that transformation was refused, he shook the dust and moved on. And the consequence for that rejection was painted as severe. More bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah, he said, than for towns that rejected the mercy offered.
Wow, that's harsh.
It is. This is the man who fed you without asking your tax status, but who would not feed you twice if you mocked the miracle. It really does provide this provocative aha moment, highlighting a confrontational, discerning side of mercy that we rarely discuss, let alone apply, in modern welfare contexts, which tend to prioritize unconditional, endless giving almost above everything else.
And looking at it through that asshole Jesus lens really throws the modern system's problems into sharp relief, doesn't it? Its inability to act with that kind of clarity, those boundaries that focus on transformation. Why can't our systems do that?
That's the core argument. The source claims the modern system does not know how to do this. It's fundamentally caught in this deep, maybe inescapable moral contradiction. It wants to be infinitely merciful with someone else's money. That's a critical point, right? It's not the giver's personal funds directly on the line. It's collective money, which changes the psychology.
Right, it's easier to be generous with other people's money.
Maybe. And the system desires transformation without offense, pity without limits. It tries, paradoxically, to create the kingdom of heaven funded by Caesar's purse and empire's breadlines with a moral glow of the loaves and fishes. This combination, this attempt to fuse state power with spiritual ideals, source strongly implies, is inherently flawed, unsustainable. The modern system wants all the moral warm fuzzies of pure giving, but without the hard edges, the necessary boundaries, or the demand for genuine reception and personal responsibility that you see in those gospel stories.
So when this contradiction inevitably causes problems when the milk dries up, as the source puts it, or fatigue really bites the system, just points fingers everywhere else, never at its own fundamental design issue.
That's exactly the critique. When these built-in contradictions lead to trouble, the money runs low, the fatigue is overwhelming, the optics of undeservingness dominate the conversation. The system invariably blames the beggar for being proud, the taxpayer for being cruel, the politician for being tight-fisted.
Anyone but the system itself.
Right. What it never blames, according to this analysis, is the moral contradiction that feeds the fatigue, right from the start. The system consistently avoids facing the fact that its basic design, built on this idea of endless, unearned compassion funded by anonymous others, inevitably clashes with these deeply ingrained human psychological and moral realities. It's a really powerful critique of the system's inability to square its stated goals of transformation and dignity with its actual mechanisms, which, ironically, often seem to incentivize ongoing dependence.
Okay, so if you're caught in this modern system and you want the milk to keep flowing, you want the aid to continue, what does our source suggest the con that required performance needs to look like? It sounds like a truly awful, almost cynical reality for people to live in.
It is a deeply uncomfortable truth, yeah. But the source presents it as the honest answer if we really want to understand the current, often frustrating moral economy of welfare. If the goal is simply for the milk to keep flowing, meaning for aid to continue consistently and the system to keep functioning without a major moral backlash, then the source says bluntly, you must keep the performance tight.
Keep the performance tight. What does that entail?
It means the ruin must be visible. The need has to be undeniable, overt, constantly shown to the giver. It also means the scraping must be audible. That's a powerful metaphor for constantly, obviously demonstrating helplessness, gratitude, ongoing need. The mat must stay in view, ensuring that symbol of dependency, of being unable to stand, is always right there, front and center. And of course, the grateful, thank you, sir, must always be ready. A performance of humility, of indebtedness.
So it's not just about acting helpless. It's actively suppressing any sign that you might be okay, that you might be healing, just to keep the system comfortable.
That's exactly the implication. The warning from the source is stark. Never stand up too straight unless you are ready to stand fully on your own and register yourself with the priests. In other words, don't show any signs of getting better, of self-sufficiency, recovery, independence, physically, mentally, whatever, unless you are truly ready to walk away from the system entirely and take on full societal responsibility.
And definitely never broadcast the hidden legs.
Absolutely. Because if the recipient looks too capable, too whole, too normal, then the system has no patience for healed people who keep asking for the scraps. The source drives this home with a powerful consequence. The village will feel cheated. That deep, primordial resentment kicks right back in. And then everyone pays. Public support dries up, calls for cuts get louder, and the overall willingness of society to provide aid just shrinks.
That's a pretty bleak diagnosis, a system that accidentally keeps people stuck in the very condition it says it wants to fix. So the real moral disease isn't just a few people cheating, it's the system demanding this endless performance of need. The system itself prevents real healing.
That's the core argument. The moral disease, then, is not that some people fake need. It is that the system quietly demands they perform it perpetually. It's this insidious built-in pressure, that ancient radical principle from the Gospels. You receive without charge, give without charge, gets twisted in the modern world into something like, but never stand up too straight when you do. That's the central
And
paradox.
if you do try to stand up.
If you dare, if you show signs of healing, growth, independence, you immediately face a whole new set of obstacles. And if you do stand up, brace yourself for the next round of paperwork to prove you are still deserving. It creates this endless ritual, this perpetual cycle of having to prove you're still needy, still incapable. Show yourself to the priest, show yourself to the caseworker, show yourself to the taxpayer. The image the source leaves us with is almost tragic. The healed must always carry a mat just in case, this symbolic burden, this need to keep performing for the system, even after you're supposedly better or self-sufficient.
Given this really deep diagnosis, it's so tempting, isn't it, to just try and paper over this tension. With soft slogans, maybe universal basic income or just better guardrails, trying to fix it with more policy, more rules. But our source seems to suggest a different path towards a cure. It sounds like it's less about tweaking policies and more about a fundamental shift in how we see the whole thing, a return to a harder truth.
It really is. The source suggests that maybe a more honest response might be to see it for what it is, a moral economy that never truly outgrew its ancient scripts. It's about actually acknowledging this deep, uncomfortable human dynamic instead of constantly pretending it's not there or trying to wish it away with programs that might be well-intentioned but don't address the root issue.
So look back to that clarity Jesus had.
Exactly. The source returns to his unflinching clarity about giving and receiving. He fed people because they were hungry, then told them to follow him or not. His mercy aimed at transformation, not perpetual care. He did not keep them on the mat forever. The expectation was always stand up, move on, live fully.
Yeah.
He did not shame the giver or the receiver for needing bread in the first place. No judgment on the initial need. But he did not beg to stay in a town that rejected him. The healed who spat on the gift got nothing more. That's a model of mercy that's both incredibly generous and incredibly discerning, empowering but also clearly bounded. It really challenges us to think about where responsibility lies and what the real point of giving aid should be.
But that kind of clarity, that kind of discerning mercy with edges, it just seems completely missing from our current systems.
And that's precisely the problem highlighted. No such clarity exists now. Our modern system feels trapped in this elaborate, frustrating, ultimately self-defeating loop, this kind of theater. And so the theater drags on, half compassion, half suspicion. The symbols of need just persist. The mat stays visible. The stick keeps knocking the bowl. The beggar rocks his rolling pallet for the camera. The taxpayer scrolls and stews. The bureaucrat grows the paperwork. It's just this exhausting cycle for everyone involved.
A cycle fed by the lack of clarity.
Fed by the lack of clarity and maybe by a reluctance to confront the core contradiction. The source implies that the breast keeps producing milk so long as no one stands up too far, and reminds us that mercy was never meant to keep people small. The implicit goal of mercy, in this view, should be independence, not continued dependence. The source concludes that a real cure for welfare fatigue, if one exists, won't come from humiliating the beggar for wanting to stand or from shaming the taxpayer for wanting proof that mercy is not locked. Those are just surface reactions, symptoms.
So where does it come from?
It suggests it will emerge only from a harder, older question the Gospels asked in full. What is mercy for, if not to help a man stand? And what do we owe when he will not? That really forces us to confront the deepest purpose and maybe the inherent limits of our compassion in our complex systems. It makes us ask really uncomfortable questions about agency, responsibility, and what human flourishing actually looks like. Hashtag outro.
Well, this deep dive has certainly unpacked the real core tension behind welfare fatigue. It's definitely not just about money or budgets or simple cheating, is it? It's about this deep, ancient human need almost to see helplessness in people receiving aid and the resulting psychological toll on the givers, that fatigue.
Yeah, and we've seen how the source argues it's not just about individual acts of fraud, but this really complex mutual performance, a kind of societal agreement driven by this profound moral contradiction built into our modern systems. The system, trying so hard to provide universal care, accidentally ends up incentivizing the very performance of need that ultimately fuels its own fatigue. It leaves everyone feeling kind of frustrated, maybe resentful.
And it leaves us with those really challenging questions from the source. Questions that get right to the essence of how we interact, how compassion works. What is mercy for, if not to help a man stand? And what do we owe when he will not? Those don't have easy answers at all.
Not at all. They force us to look way beyond just policy tweaks, right into the basic nature of human generosity, dignity, personal agency. Maybe, just maybe, for the milk to keep flowing in a way that's actually healthy, sustainable, and dignifying for everyone, maybe we have to fundamentally grapple with that provocative idea that mercy, true mercy, was never meant to keep people small or stuck in dependency forever.
That is definitely something worth mulling over. We really hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, a fresh, maybe challenging perspective on a topic that so often feels stuck in the same old arguments. Until next time.